In the remote uplands of Central Africa, this monument marks a beginning. With these drops of water, the River Nile begins its 4,000-mile journey northward to the Mediterranean, crossing half a continent and 7,000 years of recorded human history. On its banks, civilization built early marvels. Kingdoms rose and fell, gods appeared and vanished. Their destinies inseparably joined to the river. None were masters of it. More than ever dependent on the life stream of the Nile, man still tries to impose his rule. To learn the impact of his growing intrusion, Cousteau team members study the changes now occurring in the Earth's longest river. Transported by the expedition's specially fitted PBY Catalina, the team members will follow the entire course of the Nile in their 10-month journey, encounter the endlessly various life still sustained by the river. Some of it little altered since prehistoric times. Always, in its passage across a changing landscape and the shifting patterns of life upon it, the river went its own way. Man's early devices had little effect upon it. Now, increasingly, man's machines have the power to alter the Nile forever. Not only are ancient cultures and animal sanctuaries threatened by extinction, but men are learning that technological triumphs sometimes create problems greater than the ones they seek to solve. On the Nile, man has preserved some of his noblest monuments. Today, it is the river itself that may be most in need of his protection. Travelers upon and beneath the seas, Philippe and Jacques Cousteau this time take to the air. Their first destination, the mountain headwaters of the Nile. As the Catalina climbs above the waters off Corsica, the Cousteaus leave behind the Calypso in which they have been charting the Mediterranean's increasing pollution. Now they will study the greatest of its river systems, the Nile, which once emptied as much as 84 billion cubic meters of water into the inland sea each year. Flying southward, the Cousteau's path will cross the waterless Sahara to the Ruwenzori Range, once called the Mountains of the Moon. Part of Africa's great central rift, it forms a vast escarpment, sometimes rising 16,000 feet into the equatorial sky, close to the Catalina's operational ceiling. Here in midair hangs the true source of the Nile, the moisture-laden clouds moving eastward from the Atlantic that make the Ruwenzori Mountains one of the wettest regions on Earth. and for the Catalina, threading its way among the peaks, one of the most hazardous. Trapped by the snow-capped summits of the Great Barrier, cooled by the upper altitudes, the clouds release their rain on the mountain slopes, running off through wild upland streams into the great catch basins of Lake Albert and Lake Victoria, major reservoir from which the upper White Nile flows. Descending through the broken overcast, the travelers at last glimpse the swift current of the upper Nile. Here, still nearly as unspoiled as it was at its discovery, more than a century ago. As Captain Cousteau traces their course upstream through Uganda, Philippe brings the Catalina low over the clustered Sessi Islands in the northern end of Lake Victoria, only a few miles from the airport of Entebbe. It is here that the Cousteaus first sight a strange phenomenon. Clusters of wraith-like columns rising from the surface of the lake.
Okay, let's go down lower.
Suspecting that they may be water spouts or even dust twisters carried out over the lake, Philippe approaches cautiously. Even flying at an altitude of 300 feet, the swaying columns tower to double that height above the plain.
Gros nuage d'oiseaux au-dessus. Ils sont en train de se former en colonne pour, comme d'habitude. J'ai pas entendu. Ils sont en train de se former en colonne. Oui.
It is only when the Catalina is brought to the edge of one of the whirling clouds that the Cousteaus at last realize the character of the mysterious colonnades.
On commence à plus voir grand-chose.
They are lake flies, veritable storms of insect life rising from the water.
Il y a peut-être intérêt à s'éloigner un petit peu et à revenir parce que les oiseaux se méfient.
Now a challenge appears. Like a great aerial armada, a phalanx of birds sweeps in to attack. Abruptly, the men aboard the Catalina are witnesses to an onslaught of predators by which nature balances accounts between one species and another.
Essaie de t'approcher un peu des oiseaux. Ah, ils sont tous au-dessus, hein, les oiseaux. Close.
Eager to follow the course of this one-sided action, Philippe brings the Catalina into a landing. Ahead of them, the dark clouds of insects are moving westward across the islands. Swept by the wind away from their natural breeding bed in the lake itself, the numbers of flies are so vast that no attrition halts their survival. Even the cumulative sound of their tiny wings is like a storm. With only 6 to 12 hours of life after rising to the surface of the lake, the flies have but a single purpose: to mate before they die. Their entire development, designed for a few climactic hours, the flies spread their wings in mating flight. Then, spent, they fall again to the surface of the lake, where the voracious tilapia and other fish await them. Today, near Jinja, a series of watery stairways mark the point where in 1862, a young British colonial officer, John Hanning Speke, first sighted Ripon Falls and determined that Lake Victoria was the major source of the Nile. Though disputed long after his accidental death, his discovery remains secure. But the Ripon Falls are all but drowned by the dam, which now regulates the flow from the lake. Landing in quieter waters downstream from Lake Victoria, the airborne travelers make rendezvous with members of the overland team. Leaving the Catalina at anchor, the Cousteau set out by caravan across Uganda's primitive backcountry, still alive with one of the world's last great assemblies of wild animals.
Year by year, with growing haste, Africa strides out of an ancient world into the present. Still, as we move through these open savannas, I feel myself almost a stranger, a tourist in another time. Most of us who have been brought up in the so-called developed countries have seen these animals only in zoos. Here, in their native habitat, I feel that I am returning to some storybook period in the history of life, visiting the images of a childhood we ourselves no longer remember. For these animals, these infinitely varied inventions of nature still convey to us a sense of the miraculous. In a world that encourages uniformity, that judges values by their utility, perhaps these animals, like so many of their kind, also are doomed to disappear in favor of some more commercially useful species. Yet I cannot avoid a bitter sense of loss that we, born to a world that still held these creatures, are being robbed of a priceless inheritance. A life that welcomes diversity, not sameness, that treasures astonishment and wonder instead of boredom.
Deadly huntress, the lioness does not always make her kill. In the bush, even the vehicles falter. The good-natured local inhabitants sometimes wind up pushing them. Led by Philippe, the team moves on. With Dominique Soumian and the camera crew, he leaves the Catalina to search for the island refuge of a creature whose numbers constitute 1/5 of all living mammal species, the bat. Protected by the river's torrent from natives who eat them, a great colony of the flying mammals here festoons the branches of the trees. hanging in untidy clusters, awaiting nightfall, the fox-faced bats stir uneasily, quick to quarrel. At last, as twilight approaches, the bat population comes to life. A fruit-eating species, they will spend the night foraging for bananas, mangoes, pineapples, and other fruits, sometimes threatening the crops of farmers and commercial growers. Near daybreak, with an unsteady rush of wings, the bats return. Glutted, they gather once more upon the branches, sometimes bend them down almost to breaking. As the night foragers hang in sleep, other hunters awaken in the dawn. Across the still waters, Ugandan fishermen strike the surface, trying to frighten the fish into their nets. Near shore waits the patient shadow of another formidable hunter, the marabou stork. Aboard the Catalina also, life begins to stir. Atop the waist of the craft, protected by netting against the attack of insects, Dominique has found a cool and private berth, safely aloof from the mundane chores below. As a standard precaution against parasitic organisms endemic in some sections of the Nile Basin, the water is carefully filtered and boiled. Otherwise, Philippe and his companions might be breakfasting in the dining room of a well-staffed hotel.
King rice.
Across the surface of the lake, a string of pelicans also arrives to consider the day's menu. Oblivious both to the team's rubber raft and to the hippos lazing in the lake, the pelicans are perfectly mannered guests, catching their fish in flawless unison.
To the tiny islands that dot the lake come other visitors. The shores of the lake are occupied by permanent residents, often hostile to intruders. But here, in clustered shelters of papyrus reeds, the rejected Karamoja from the harsh lands to the northeast come to find seasonal refuge and food, squatters on the lake itself. Approaching one of the temporary guests, I find that the visitor also speaks English, now a common language in a nation of many diverse dialects.
You fisherman here? Yes, I'm a fisherman. What do you catch? I fish in these tilapias. Tilapia? Yeah. Oh. Are you from French?
Yes.
How is the French? Quite all right?
Hmm?
Is it French all right?
Oh, yeah.
Ah.
Very much.
Have you come to catch fish?
No, we come to visit.
Oh.
You have a boat?
Yes, I have a boat. I have gone down there.
Oh, I see. From another fisherman, I hear the reasons that bring so many of the Karamoja to the islands for nearly half of each year.
He's pottering us.
Hmm?
This man. Is he pottering us?
Is he what?
Pottering. Taking our pictures.
Yes. Are you from here, from this region?
No, I'm from Central Karamoja there.
Central Karamoja?
Yes.
How is it there?
There is all right anyway. And cultivation
Is
type
there,
of the
is
well.
there a lot of water there?
Water?
You have
No.
streams, rivers?
No. Sort of just
Desert?
nothing.
Nothing.
There is no like even rivers.
No?
Yes.
Is that why you
We
come?
just depend on bore wells only.
Oh.
Yes.
Is that why you come here?
Yes.
For the water?
For the water and for fish also. Because we are lacking meat.
I see. How long have you been here?
We have taken about 5 months.
5 months?
Yes.
You go back to Karamoja?
We shall have to go back for just a room, then we come back.
Where do you like it best, here or over there?
No, here.
Why don't you stay here?
Yeah, we stay here because we have now plenty of meat here. Everything I get, plenty. Yes.
Dried or smoked upon the racks by the exultant tribesmen, vast quantities of tilapia and other fish are prepared for use either for food or as barter for other goods in leaner months to come.
I went to Nagongo. Konkane file bizungu byalo. Mwana ati anukira wote.
The purpose of working is money.
Like distant children far from home, they return to the river in times of trouble. To each, the Nile is mother, protector, food and water, survival. Here, even the great marabou stork, which can kill a flamingo with a single blow of its heavy bill, comes in hope of an easy meal.
Now tranquility is left behind. In swift descent, the river rushes northward in a succession of wild rapids. Followed on its course by the Cousteaus in the Catalina, the Nile plunges through one of the most spectacular events in its 4,000-mile journey, the Murchison Falls, discovered in 1864 by an aristocratic English sportsman and his indomitable wife, Samuel and Florence Baker. In a low-level run that brings a moment of silent tension aboard the aircraft, Philippe dares the treacherous downdrafts above the falls for a closer view. With only minor damage to the nose, the Catalina is brought to a safe landing in calmer waters below the falls. Then in the rubber boats, the Cousteaus return upstream against the heavy 6-knot current. Maneuvering their craft with difficulty through a turmoil of spray and heaving waters, they manage at last to approach the base of the falls. There, pressed through a rocky gap barely 20 feet wide, the entire volume of the Victoria Nile seems to explode with volcanic force. Released from tension, the Nile moves on more calmly through a broadening valley. Here again, in its passage through marsh and meadow, uncounted species take their life from the river. A basking crocodile, a flight of African skimmers, an elephant with her infant progeny. But on each species, nature has struck a balance, set a limitation. Elephant numbers are kept in check by loss of forage. Against zebra, gazelle, or antelope, nature has set lion and leopard to eat their fill. Against the armored crocodile, she has sent more devious foes, predators to rob the nest. Surprisingly agile, this female crocodile has climbed the steep bank to make her nest, burying her eggs in the sandy soil high above the rush of the river. But many a nest does not survive, pillaged by relentless predators such as the monitor lizard. Interrupted at his feeding, the monitor flees the members of the Cousteau team, leaving behind a debris of broken shells. But among them, one small, prematurely exposed crocodile survives.
Il bouge, regarde. On va le mettre à l'eau. Faut le mettre à l'eau. Faut le mettre à l'eau parce que sinon il va pas vivre. Faut le mettre là. Quick. Fais gaffe à la mer parce que je vais pas vraiment.
Pas trop tout de suite. Laisse-le un peu au bord, qu'il s'habitue à l'eau.
Bon,
Placed in the river by its rescuers, the little reptile swims off to continue a life so rudely begun.
Ça va aller là, va aller là.
Silently watching the rescue, the maternal crocodile fulfills some dim guardian role. But it is doubtful that she ever will recognize her offspring again. Later, Philippe and his companions move unchallenged among the herds of hippopotami. Ordinarily peaceful when left alone, they are not always as docile as they appear. Yearly, they take a higher toll of human life than do either lions or elephants. Especially bad-tempered during mating season, bulls sometimes kill rivals with slashing attacks of their huge teeth. A fatal result generally rare among members of the same wild species. Often as heavy as 2 tons, ungainly on feet too small for their bulk, the hippos nonetheless leave the water at night, sometimes walk for several miles to graze and consume as much as 400 pounds of grass before returning to the river. groomed and rid of parasites by his guest, the hippopotamus is sometimes careless of reciprocal courtesies. Probable birthplace of man, site of a spectacular early civilization, much of Africa long lay shrouded from Western eyes. The north, from Red Sea to the Atlantic, fell under Arab dominance as early as the 7th century. Much later, the southern tip was conquered by the Europeans. Central Africa, its geography and its peoples, remained almost as elusive and shy as the fabled Sitatunga, a marshland water buck, which hides underwater and sometimes dies of sheer fright. Yet, seemingly immune to intrusion, the isolation of equatorial Africa was maintained not by armed resistance against alien visitors. By an irony of history, its black tribal cultures and rich wildlife were preserved by the very thing that was its curse, the tsetse fly. Traveling overland with the Cousteau team, a Belgian scientist, Jules Hanotier, explains. Although no more than one tsetse fly in 1,000 carries the germ of trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, the insect, says Mr. Hanotier, has been a lethal barrier against foreign settlers. Through centuries of exposure, wild animals have developed immunity to the disease carried by the fly. But domesticated animals, such as cattle, which flourish in drier regions, are easy victims. If it were not for the tsetse fly, says Mr. Hanotier, the rain-swept grazing areas of Central Africa would long ago have been turned to stock raising, and the wildlife would have vanished as it has elsewhere. Later, in the Paris Institute for the Study of Parasites and Tropical Animal Diseases, Jacques Cousteau questions a tsetse fly specialist, Dr. Jean Grouvel, regarding research experiments with the 30,000 flies maintained in his laboratory cages. Obviously, says Cousteau, the insects must represent a major threat to human ecology in Central Africa. Dr. Grouvel agrees. Not only does the tsetse fly carry its debilitating and often fatal disease to man, but its lethal effect on domestic animals has been a continuing obstacle to stock raising in the infested regions, areas in which malnutrition often is widespread. Offering to demonstrate the process by which the insect feeds, Dr. Grouvel has a tsetse fly placed upon his own arm. Quickly, the hungry fly takes its stance, inserts its tubular snout, and within a minute is ready to take blood from its donor.
En moins d'une minute, la mouche a trouvé sa place, aspire le sang.
Drawing blood until its abdomen is swollen, an infected fly simultaneously injects the parasite which it has received from diseased animals and stores in its salivary gland. Though the tsetse fly was not identified as carrier until early in this century, the symptoms of sleeping sickness itself had been commonly recognized. Nervous tremors, fevers, speech difficulty, swollen facial features, and white tongue are among the symptoms of advanced stages revealed by patients in the Lirangu hospital in Sudan.
What are his chances of improving?
Well, it depends. Sometimes you have very spectacular recoveries.
Denying sleep to its victims, the disease produces instead a comatose lethargy, which finally fades into death. Downstream, beyond the range of the Tsetse, the Catalina reaches the Sud, a vast swamp as large as England, in which the Nile itself seems to lose its way and its identity as a river. Here, safe from the baleful fly, cattle are central to the existence of the Dinka, one of the Nilotic tribes which occupy the tracts of land hidden within the Sud. Even the dung of the cattle, when burned, provides a protective smoke cloud, and the ashes to coat bodies against the myriad mosquitoes and marsh insects that swarm about them. More out of curiosity than urgent need, the Dinka villagers accept the pills and salves and minor applications of first aid offered by members of the Cousteau team.
You should take it with water.
Not vastly impressed by Western culture and its ways, the Dinka long ago developed their own backcountry medicine. Again, the wastes of cattle serve a vital function. Their urine is widely used as an antiseptic, as a food preservative, sometimes combined with ashes as an extra protection against insect bites. Even the babies are carefully bathed in urine to forestall infections. Living as members of the tribal families, the cattle themselves are not eaten until they die of natural causes. But their milk, and sometimes even small quantities of their blood drawn from neck punctures, are a food resource shared by man and animal alike. A healthy, cheerful people, the Dinka are content with a life based on the fullest use of minimal resources. Fiercely independent, the nomadic tribe builds only temporary shelters, moving upland and down with the rise and fall of the Nile. Even play has a purpose. Here, a Dinka girl is painted for a dance that is part of the social rites leading to courtship and marriage. But her role is as a judge, not as a participant. It is the men who must strut and dance in a staged display, trying to impress the hard-eyed village maidens, holding up fingers telling how many cattle they own, a promise of security in lean times to come. On. Today, even in the slow-flying Catalina, the Sud can be crossed by air in little more than a few hours. But in the past, its shifting maze of channels blocked by water hyacinths or papyrus reeds, the vast marsh required months to cross by boat. Just as the tsetse fly isolated much of Central Africa, so the labyrinths of swamp and its masses of vegetation have helped conceal dry land areas that today form the last great natural animal refuge left on the continent. Aboard the Catalina, the automatic receiver prints a facsimile weather map from the Central Forecasting Agency, warning of a severe storm front moving across their course. Philippe decides to bring the plane down near one of the Shilluk tribal villages scattered for 250 miles along the Nile's meandering watercourse. While fishermen from the village pull in their nets, members of the Cousteau team secure the Catalina against the imminent downpour. Though nearly one-half of the White Nile's total volume is lost by evaporation from the vast shallows of the Sud, the loss is replaced by tropical storms such as this and by the entry of the tributary river, the Sobat, at the Sud's northern perimeter. Closely related to the Dinka, the Shilluk are markedly different, taking much of their food from the river itself. Unlike the Dinka's autonomous bands, the Shilluk have a long tradition of divine kingship. For a people scattered over wide distances, the king not only provides a unifying presence, but is indeed the living symbol of the tribe's prosperity and survival. Long tradition prescribes that a king be ritually killed when his powers begin to fail or disaster strikes the tribe. Yet both in years of want or plenty, the waters of the Nile are so clouded with sediment that none of the Shilluk have ever observed the fish they catch, swimming in their natural habitat. To film some of the Nile species and display their underwater behavior to the tribesmen themselves, Philippe and Dominique have assembled a portable tank. Into it now, one by one, are placed the various living specimens netted by the villagers. Among them, a formidable predator, the tigerfish. Adorned by their characteristic rows of beaded scars, the villagers watch as Philippe demonstrates the use of a diver's snorkel. Below the surface, the captured fish swim in this strange new environment. Nile perch that sometimes grow to 150 pounds. Tilapia, whose tiny offspring in times of danger take refuge in the father's mouth. The catfish, equipped for the Nile's clouded waters with the feelers by which it probes its way along the bottom. Eager to try this new device, one of the young villagers dons the snorkel to explore a world which has been beside him all his life, but which he has never seen. Unlike the nomadic Dinka, the Shilluk have created permanent villages of their conical dwellings. Well outside the tsetse fly's range, they too have cattle and live a relatively tranquil existence. Seldom raid their neighbors as in former times, at least openly, no longer kill their failing kings. But, free of the tsetse, they were also devoid of its protection. Tranquil now, generations of Shilluk were frequent targets of slavers. Though Arabs were the major buyers, most raids were carried out by other conquered blacks, armed by the slave traders. Destroying an entire village in a sudden sweep, the raiders would leave dead and wounded behind, take their living quarry, chained like animals, for sale at Khartoum, far to the north. As the river itself journeys north, it too enters a landscape vastly changed. Henceforth, it is the single thread of life through a desert in which every blade of green growth will depend on the river. As the ancient Latin saying holds, Ot nihilus, ot nihil, either the Nile or nothing. At Khartoum, capital of Sudan, the White Nile is joined by its sister tributary, the Blue Nile out of Ethiopia, which will contribute nearly 2/3 of the Lower Nile's annual flow. Now a little past midpoint in the Nile's long descent, more than 2,200 miles from its headwaters, Philippe lands the Catalina near the presidential palace, scene of much of the past century's turbulent history. Once a great slave market at which Arabs bought captured blacks from the interior, Khartoum no longer traffics in human life. Today it is a trading center for camels, the cranky beasts which for more than 1,000 years have carried goods on the caravan routes radiating westward across the Sahara. Khartoum would play a belated role in the great tide of Muslim and Arab influence, which swept North Africa and for a time reached even into Spain and France. Here, less than a century ago, occurred the climactic struggle between Western and Islamic cultures that would bring Black Africa out of its continental isolation forever. Though Western technology often has been the mainspring for new economic growth and development in Sudan, the religious teachings of Islam still hold sway. Here, visitors to the mosque may join the faithful, gathered for prayers 5 times each day. In the palace, the chanted prayers have an ironic echo, for this, in the 1870s, was the citadel of General Charles George Gordon, adventurer and mystic, once the appointed leader of Christian England's crusade against the Arab slave trade. But to England's moral crusade came a Muslim reply, a jihad, or holy war, led by a religious leader known as the Mahdi, or guide. In March of 1884, in the ornate palace, Gordon would find himself a prisoner, Khartoum isolated by the surrounding forces of the Mahdi. For 10 months, defiant but helpless, Gordon could gaze across to the far bank of the Nile, waiting for relief, which never came. At last, in January 1885, the Mahdi's forces swarmed across the river into the starving city and swept up these stairs to find their hated adversary waiting for their spears. In hours, Khartoum was won, Gordon was dead, and the Mahdi reigned in triumph. But the triumph would be brief. In less than a year, the Mahdi was dead. In 1898, less than 15 years after Gordon's defeat and death, the tables again were turned. Here, behind these clay walls at Omdurman, a few miles from Khartoum, the Mahdi's followers themselves would await the onslaught of the British forces under Lord Kitchener. In their decisive defeat, the slave trade in Africa was finally and irretrievably destroyed.
But there were other changes, no less profound. Brutally awakened by the cannons of foreign powers, much of Africa has passed from isolation to colonialism to self-rule in barely a century. After the explorers and the moral crusaders came the generals and the businessmen and the engineers. The gunboat was followed by the steam shovel and the tractor. Today, the Nile no longer goes its own way. Year by year, like the tiny people of Lilliput trying to chain a Gulliver, well-intentioned men try to bind the giant to their wishes. As we fly northward toward Egypt and the Mediterranean, the Nile still has more than 1,800 miles to travel. The wild freedom of its upland cataracts and rapids, the vestiges of a more primitive continent, lie behind it. Henceforth, mile by mile, the river will be progressively tamed, learn to do as it is told. Yet, as we follow the river through the land of the ancient pharaohs, we shall discover that modern man, impatient for quick solutions, cannot always foresee the consequences of the changes he imposes, that the Nile itself, sometimes, is still wiser than he.
In its northward journey through half the African continent, the Nile crosses not only distance, but time. For uncounted centuries, the river has mirrored the passage of men and animals that have drawn life from it. A life often little changed since the first farmers came to its desert valley. Their existence regulated by the rise and fall of the river, many of the peasants or fellaheen still water their fields and turn the soil with tools unchanged since recorded history began. The fellaheen endure. The early civilizations out of which they came have long since vanished, leaving behind their burial chambers and broken temples, mute testaments of past glory and a brief tenure of power. Today, a new civilization stands on the Nile. But, as the Cousteau team discovers, the present, no less than the past, still owes its existence to the river. Year by year, more lives are suspended on the river's slender thread. In the expanding cities of Egypt and the Sudan, in Cairo and Khartoum, in Alexandria or Juba, the populations multiply, threaten to outpace the food supplied by the river's narrow margin of fertile earth. Egypt remains, as an early historian described it, the gift of the Nile, a crowded oasis locked in the immense emptiness of the desert. To meet growing needs, men have built huge structures across the Nile, turned the river god into a servant. But sometimes technology itself creates new dangers, threatens the very human ends it tries to serve.
Our problem begins in 1960,
Yes.
when the Egyptian government determined to build the high dam. And the government told us to get out from here to New Halfa, but we refused.
For most of its course since early history, the Nile has provided a clearly marked path between Central Africa and the sea. But in southern Sudan, in the vast marshlands of the Sud, even the river seems to lose its way. Below Philippe Cousteau and the Catalina spreads a watery archipelago as large as England. Through the maze of channels that in the past sometimes took months to cross, the barge carrying the men and vehicles of the Cousteau overland team threads its way north toward rendezvous. In this great shallow basin, where the upper Nile loses half its water through evaporation, an endlessly varied life shares sanctuary. Here, hidden amid the drifting masses of water hyacinth and papyrus that often clog the channels, thousands of scattered tribesmen, Nuer, Dinka, or Shilluk, live in a world apart. Changing yet changeless, the Nile flows through their lives, its seasonal rise and fall the stately measures of eternity. As plane and barge make rendezvous in the northern stretches of the Sud, Philippe and his companions change transport for a further journey. By swamp vehicle, they penetrate the domain of one of the remaining tribal monarchs, still formally recognized by the Sudanese government. Like the river itself, the king of the Shilluks too is a symbol of eternity. Here, posing for Philippe with his family, with his possessions and his prized herds of cattle, with Sudanese representatives and his private guard, he is a living link between past and future, the visible assurance of tribal continuity. Because Shilluk legend still celebrates an earlier French visitor, Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand, who led an historic march across Africa more than 8 decades ago, Philippe and the team are honored with a ceremonial display. Later, in audience with the king, Philippe is shown faded photographs of the king's ancestor with Captain Marchand, whose small party, well supplied with champagne, briefly challenged British power on the Nile.
I would like to know from His Majesty what part of the Nile does his kingdom cover?
He's now calling one of the ships.
Referred to the council, Philippe's question is answered by a spokesman, saying the king's authority extends over a wide area of the Sud. But for the king of the Shillooks and the river gods of the Nile, eternity is coming to an end. A new god has come to rule. Across the land, a great rotary excavating machine is cutting the Jonglei Canal, a 200-mile trench which will provide a year-round waterway between north and south, drain vast areas of the Sud, and carry the marshland waters to irrigation tracts downstream. But as Philippe learns from a project engineer, many of the canal's uses and its impact on people, animals, plants, and weather are still largely undefined.
Dans le dessin technique du canal tel qu'il est maintenant, est-ce qu'il est prévu de s'en servir pour l'irrigation de la campagne?
Asked if the canal will allow cheap irrigation by gravity flow, Engineer Voronkov replies that the canal level will not be high enough for such a system. Instead, a large network of pumping stations will be required for water distribution.
Actuellement, par contrat, qu'est-ce qui est prévu?
What provisions, Philippe asks, have been made for wild animals to cross the canal? There has been talk, says Voronkov, about providing for the seasonal movements of both people and animals, but nothing has been done. Such matters are not covered in the contract. In the quiet dusk, Philippe's questions about future consequences remain unanswered. Leaving the straight trench through which the meandering White Nile will soon bypass much of the Sud, Philippe and his companions again head northward in the Catalina. Now at last, the team encounters the Blue Nile, the great sister tributary flowing down from the mountains of Ethiopia. Bearing in summer flood a huge burden of fertile silt, it joins the White Nile north of Khartoum. Here, a vast tract of land has been reclaimed, irrigated by water impounded behind the nearby Jebel Olia Dam. In Jebel Olia's reservoir, a mass of green vegetation spreads across its surface. But the countermeasures against it themselves present new difficulties and dangers, according to Sudanese expert Dr. Hassim El-Maghrabi.
How much do they spray like that every year?
Well, exactly 1,000 tons of the 2,4-D, which is a lot of herbicide.
2,4-D?
Yeah, 2-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid.
And that's a defoliant.
Yes.
What is the effect on the environment?
Well, there is a general decrease in the productivity of the White Nile. An immense decrease, as a matter of fact.
It takes what for? Fish don't grow, or?
Well, larvae fish die. Species like the tilapia, which makes a nest on the ground, does not find the opportunity to do so because the layer of the decomposed water hyacinth is several feet sometimes.
Whatever the risks, fishermen still cast their nets into the waters they always have trusted. Offered for human consumption, last link in the food chain. Several fish are bought by Philippe for later analysis.
Would this type be a good indicator?
Not the best, but it could be a good indicator.
Could be good?
Yeah.
Led by the Nile, the Cousteau team moves on. For the first time, far from its upland beginnings and the languid expanses of the Sud, the river enters the great North African desert. Henceforth, the green-edged stream, its vegetation often barely a few yards wide, will be the only source of life for the peoples of northern Sudan and all of Egypt. In a basin between desert ridges, the river becomes the inland sea, called Lake Nuba in Sudan, Lake Nasser in Egypt, stretching more than 300 miles southward from Aswan High Dam. One of the engineering marvels of the modern world, a half-mile thick at its base, 364 feet high, more than 2 miles long, the Aswan High Dam dwarfs even the pyramids. A joint Soviet-Egyptian effort formally begun by Premier Khrushchev and President Nasser in 1960. The High Dam has abruptly altered the long history of the Nile. Though lower dams had been built since 1902, men for the first time could boast that they now commanded the river. In the tremendous rush of water through its spillway, they saw the promise of food for their multiplying populations. Hopes described to Philippe by Chairman Ahmadi Raouf of the Nile Valley Authority.
The High Dam is constructed for three purposes. For water, for the river control, for affecting all the floods in the continuous years, and for generating about 10 billion kilowatt hour of electricity, and to serve the water as a storage of water to be safe during all the coming years.
Carried to distant pumping stations, much of the High Dam's 10 billion kilowatt capacity is used to lift water into the network of irrigation canals. From these, in turn, the flow is drawn into smaller channels, spreading through greening fields of cotton and maize. Across the desert, new ditches draw a geometry of hope. Month by month, year by year, the growing grid reclaims new land. Through vast projects such as Kom Ombo, the High Dam is expected to increase arable land in Egypt by 1/3, more than 2 million acres. But the blessings of the High Dam are sometimes deceptive. Already, along some of the irrigation channels and fields, a sinister white crust has begun to appear. As team members Albert Falco and Dominic Sumian learn, the white residue is salt. Once it was washed away by the yearly flood, now prevented by the High Dam. Present irrigation methods often simply leach the salt to the surface of the desert soil, threatening to return the reclaimed fields to wasteland.
So about the salinity, we treat the land by making open drains and tile drainage in the old areas. And in the new areas, we make our projects. The irrigation projects and the drainage projects must go parallel to each other in the same time. So the land will not suffer in the future by the salinity.
Often in former years, the floods brought disaster. But as they receded, they left a gift, a thin new layer of silt that at the rate of 3 inches per century has sometimes reached a depth of 50 feet. Today, farmers themselves sometimes transport the silt to add to their sandy fields.
This is 11 years old land now. We've been working this part of land. You can see the change of soil, what happened to the soil, even very deep. You'll find it completely different. This is the type of soil we got after 11 years of work. And this is the origin of the land itself. You can see the difference if I just put you this and that. You'll see the difference of soil, what happened during 11 years of very hard work.
Swept down from the mountain highlands, often as much as 40 million tons in a year, the waterborne clouds of silt spread over the valley of the Nile, enriching and renewing the land. In the central Sudan, near Khartoum, the flood still brings its precious burden of fertile loam, feeding trees and crops in a yearly rite. But trapped behind the Aswan High Dam, no silt now reaches the fields of Egypt.
And for fertility of the land, the mud, the sediment was very important.
Yes, yes.
And how is that being replaced?
We increase the quantity of fertilizers. That's all. It is used also in the States and in all the countries, all other countries like Germany and.
Yeah, but the purchase or manufacturing of fertilizers costs money. Also.
Yes, we have already. We are fortunate because we have a very big factory in Aswan, Kima.
Yes, we visited
factory,
there.
yes.
To compensate for the loss of the silt, much of the dam's electric power is utilized in the production of vast quantities of fertilizer. This in turn must be shipped by barge from Aswan along the river which once carried it to the farmers' fields without expense. Nor does the factory's output of 300,000 tons per year begin to match the need of 5 times that amount for the Upper Nile alone. But not all the dam's effects can be measured in coin or human hunger. Today, a great circular cofferdam marks payment of a debt to the past. The famed monuments and temples of Philae have been resurrected and saved from oblivion. Stone by stone, at a safe height above the lake, artisans are restoring the courts and colonnades of Egyptian and Roman rule, the serried steps, or Nilometer, by which the ancients measured the rise and fall of the river. South from Philae, an unparalleled international effort already had rescued one of the supreme treasures of Western civilization's beginnings, the massive rock temples of Abu Simbel, here visited by Philippe and Sumyan. Today, history is their only kingdom. Yet serene and imperial, seemingly immune to defeat or disbelief, the great figures stare across the centuries, mute reminders they help make us what we are. Tokens of our brief history, they too might have vanished beneath the lake. Instead, around an arching buttress, a great mound of stone was built to provide a new and secure site for the colossal statues and their adjoining sanctuaries. The ancients believed the Nile came from the land of the ghosts. Today, the ghosts lie here. The waters cover not only uncounted monuments and tombs and traces of prehistory in the river's desert corridor. They have drowned the fields and habitations of people still living, most of them now exiles, 1,000 miles away. Near the site of Wadi Halfa, a former town commissioner talks of the one-time river port and desert center.
This was old Alpha?
Yes, this is the mosque at the village was called the King.
It was beautiful.
Yes, it's a beautiful site. It's near the garden of the Nile Hotel. It was a very fine city. One of the oldest city in the Sudan. The population in it was about 52,000.
52,000?
Yes.
And now?
And now it is about 8,000. All people were immigrated to the new Halfa at the eastern of the Sudan. The water rise up about 50 meters.
50 meters?
Yes, 50 meters.
Yet from this harsh land, many have refused exile. Stubborn and baffled, stranded almost within sight of their former doorways, they cling in mute loyalty to a place suddenly become strange and alien. Today they are trying to begin again. Born to a desert without rain, they are becoming fishermen. A new fishing industry is being developed at various settlements around the 300-mile lake. To Jean-Paul Cornu, a member of the Cousteau team, Sudanese official Muhammad Ali tells of joint efforts to help the readjustment of Wadi Halfa's displaced survivors.
The population here, some of them who refused to leave the place and they stayed here in their place, and they have no work to do but to fish. But unfortunately, they have no the experience to fish because at that time there was no fish here, and most of them, many of them, and the majority, they don't know how to fish. So when we came here to utilize the fisheries resources in the place, we have to train the people, and we have also to have to encourage them to come to the lake and fish and make money out of this. And for this, we contact our friends in the Chinese Republic of China to assist here.
People's Republic of China.
Yes, you see Mr. Ko is with me here. They're offering us assistance under certain loan or agreement between the two governments, the Sudanese government and the Chinese government.
So you are the expert here and you are training the Sudanese people. And how many fish do you expect to fish every day?
Every
when
day.
The industry will be completed?
When the factory is completed, we plan to produce 5 tons of fish every day.
Marked by the monument to Soviet aid, the Aswan High Dam remains the pivotal structure in Egypt, central to the nation's hopes. 4,500 years ago, Aswan itself was a frontier trading center and fortress, guarding Egypt's southern approaches. Today it is again a frontier town, Egypt's face to the future. Source of more power than Egypt can yet readily use, peopled by a growing percentage of skilled technicians, site of new factories and well-supplied marketplaces, Aswan City is a symbol of prosperous modernity. It is here that a score of agencies are trying to assemble a coherent plan for the balanced development of Lake Nasser's commercial and recreational resources. Still a nation of farmers, most of Egypt's peasants still wrest a living from the soil with the tools and patient methods invented at the beginning of Western civilization. Not far from the high dam's turbines, the peasant still works his counterweighted shaduf, irrigating less than an acre between sunrise and sunset, guiding the great Nile to his little fields with a hoe. With the sakia, or water wheel, turned by a circular cog drawn by oxen, a farmer can sometimes water almost 5 acres in a day. As the team flies north, past the high dam and the first of the river cataracts, even Aswan seems an inconsequential fact at the edge of a limitless waste. Barely 4% of Egypt is arable land. All the rest is desert. Yet here too, in this wilderness, in this frozen geologic tumult of scarps and canyons and ancient riverbeds, other men have left their marks, the tombs and tracings of forgotten habitations, now locked in silence. At Deir el-Bahari, entombed in the mountain wall, the presence of Queen Hatshepsut now presides over desert space. But the fertile fields on the river's edge are reserved for the living. Along the Nile, like jewels on a necklace, remain the dazzling fragments of the civilization the river alone made possible. Komombo, Luxor, Karnak, the step pyramid of Saqqara, designed by Imhotep, civilization's first known genius. Close by, the rhomboidal pyramid companion. The celebrated pyramids of Giza, Mekarino, Kefren, Cheops. But here the life of the Nile is swiftly changing. The distance between past and present abruptly widened. Amid the commercial traffic, the familial patterns of ordinary life go on. But monuments now are hidden amid the clutter of urban sprawl. The dry, clear air that for so long has preserved ancient pyramids and temples is clouded now with the smoke of factories and refineries. An industrial haze hangs over the habitations of people unable to escape their own pollution. The river no longer carries its cargo of silt. Instead, it now bears an increasing burden of urban waste. Northward from Cairo's spreading megalopolis lies the Nile's ultimate gift, a great fertile delta that stretches in a widening triangle to the Mediterranean coast, more than 100 miles away. Here at last, the Nile divides in two, the Damietta branch eastward, the Rosetta to the west. Below the Catalina lie 8,500 square miles of the richest land in Egypt. Every foot of it transported ton by ton, century by century, by the Nile from the mountain highlands of her southern neighbors. Egypt exists on the river's gift of alien soil. Proceeding now by the expedition's vans, Philippe and his companions drive through a countryside dotted with prosperous towns and villages, through the greening fields of cotton, fruit, maize, and other crops raised not only for use in Egypt, but to be sold for export. Everywhere, like the arteries and veins of a living body, a great network of canals, ditches, and minor tributaries carry water to the fields. Near the sea, the delta receives 7 inches rainfall each year. At Cairo, less than 1. All else needed by the crops must be provided from the river's slackening flow. But for all these demands on the river, there is a price. Along the natural causeways that sometimes provide the only slim barrier between the great inland freshwater lakes and the sea, Philippe and his companions pass ominous bits of wreckage, isolated lighthouses or minarets, damaged structures. Once the river's yearly burden of sediment steadily extended the delta's shores. Today, the Nile's vastly diminished flow brings no silt at all. With Philippe, an Egyptian technician describes the consequences at the Rosetta outlet.
But this is broken. The road is disappeared.
Yeah, the road is disappeared. From 1974, last time I came here, the road extends to this Fenerit. And now the road is finished.
So the erosion is already visible. It's already destroying some installations.
Yes. You can find these columns, electrical columns.
Look, the water is already passing into the Nile there.
Yes.
Since 1974 was the last time you were here?
Yes.
And the road was intact?
Yeah, the road finished.
So in 4 years, the sea has gained about 20 meters.
All this area. All this area is gained by sea.
At the Damietta branch, too, the same process is being repeated. Here, a guide reports, the sea also threatens to breach the narrow coastal barrier, invade the lakes, and overrun the most fertile land in Egypt.
What is the rate of erosion here?
Rate of erosion? Yeah. About 1 meter per year.
1 meter per year?
From 1964 till now. Yeah.
Samples of water and bottom sediment taken from the lake by Sumian for later analysis confirm its increasing brackishness, sometimes flowing in to replace the depleted underground water tables. The salt water is infiltrating the lakes. Step by step, the sea is beginning to win the battle against the land. Across the causeway on the seaward side, a lone fisherman fights a losing battle. Once the fish were taken from these waters in the thousands of tons. Today they are gone. In Alexandria, at the Institute for Coastal Research, Director Kashem and his associate, Dr. Akram, explain why.
By the construction of the Aswan High Dam and the cessation of the Nile flood, the sardine fishery in these areas in front of the delta has completely disappeared. Because, as you see, the Nile flood with its nutrient salts and fresh water and this forms a good blooming of plankton as a food base for fishes to aggregate and collect.
We used to have an average yearly discharge from the Nile River, which is estimated at 42 kilometer cube per year, you see. So now we have only an average from 3 to 4 kilometer cube.
It's
one-tenth almost, yes. So actually 90% of the discharge has been prevented from reaching the Mediterranean.
That's not the high dam.
That's
the various irrigation.
That's due to the high dam, and the water of the Nile is now going to the land for irrigation, of course.
From hidden beginnings for countless millennia, the Nile has made its unceasing journey from the mountains to the sea. Astonished by flood in the cloudless days of summer, men in the Egyptian desert thanked Hapi, the Nile god. They did not know that the river's life and theirs came from rains and springs nearly 4,000 miles away. Across the Nile's path lay the isolated habitats of animals and men, sanctuaries filled with the creatures of some biblical bestiary, landscapes of innocent cultures, black or Bedouin, unaware that they were already doomed. Now the Nile has crossed a new threshold, moved from past to present, into a changing world filled with the sounds of engines and traffic. Abruptly, a dam barricades the river's flow. Below it, 1,000 outlets draw water from the current, bleeding the great artery to irrigate the growing crops. The river god has been dismissed. In one of the most massive attempts ever made to reorder nature, man has thrown dam after dam across the Nile. Nag Hammadi, Roseris, Sennar, Jebel Olia, Asyut, Damietta, Rosetta, Aswan High Dam, most powerful of all. We have seized the power, but the consequences are yet to be counted. Like the High Dam, these too are announcements of power, symbols of the civilization that lined the Nile with temples, that developed hieroglyphs, founded libraries, tracked the movement of stars, invented gods, provided many of the furnishings of our minds. Like the river, our beginnings too often lie beyond our sight. Yet they are gone, leaving behind only these scattered relics of a search for immortality, reminders that kings also die, and power can be no more than illusion. Mute warnings that technology and all its wonders cannot save us from the folly of our multiplying numbers. Perhaps we have mastered the river. We have yet to master ourselves. It is written of the Nile, I am all, the past, the present, and the future. Today, little of the great river enters the sea where the fisherman casts, still waiting for the wave that will fill his net.